So I'm a PhD student over with Hugh in Goddard, and this is some of the work I've been doing for the first chapter of my thesis, looking at how rapid protected area expansion impacts ecological representation. And so I'm sure, as most of you know, there's been a rapid increase in both the count and the coverage of protected areas since 1950. And in recent years, it's been attributed to global conservation targets such as Aichi Target 11, which calls for 17% of terrestrial and 10% of marine areas to be conserved by 2020. But the problem is we still have extremely high species extinction rates, and we're not really seeing the biodiversity benefits that we are wanting to achieve. And so this raises a lot of questions as to whether these protected areas are really being effective and whether the accumulation of land alone is really enough to conserve biodiversity. But no one has really explicitly tested how these periods of rapid protected area expansion impact ecological representation, which is a key component to effective protected areas. And representation just means that you're sampling, including a sample of each biodiversity feature within your protected area network, whether that be species, vegetation types, or what we used was ecoregions. So that's what I set out to do, and I think it's really important to inform different protected area strategies and for future global conservation agreements. And so how we did this is we used the protection equality metric, which is a measure of the evenness of habitat protection. So if you have two biodiversity features and they're both protected at 50%, then you'd have perfect equality of protection, or a value of 1. And if they're very unequal in their protection, you'd get a value of 0, signifying perfect inequality. And what we did is we looked at trends in this protection equality metric over the past 60 years. We tried to look and identify relationships between the annual change in the total area protected and the annual change in protection equality. And we also tried to figure out what are the fundamental drivers of these changes. And we ended up including 66 countries in this study, and some of the key results is, on a positive note, we found that protection equality has been increasing over the past 60 years, so habitats are being represented more equally within reserve networks. But out of all the 66 countries, no country had a protection equality value over 0.5, so there's still a lot of improvement that's needed. But more interestingly, our changes or increases in protection equality have not changed through time, so the increases we're experiencing today are the same as in 1950s, before representation was even defined. So with all the policies, theories, tools we have now to create representative reserves, you would potentially expect that we'd be doing a better job, but it looks like there might be some disconnects between theory and practice in creating more representative reserves. Second, we found, contrary to what we thought, that large increases in the amount of area protected also have large positive impacts on protection equality, which might become more important in the future as countries increase their land grabbing or rapid expansion to try to meet these global conservation targets. And we also uncovered a notable nuance in protection expansion strategy, saying that if you are looking to evenly represent different habitats in your network, you should expand your protected area network through multiple smaller reserves instead of single large reserves. So this kind of makes sense, as large selection units are known to either overrepresent certain features, or they allow features to kind of go into unprotected gaps, which would negatively impact your equality of representation. And lastly, we found that in the two most recent decades, we've seen a higher proportion of positive correlations between the amount of area protected and protection equality, which we interpreted to potentially mean that countries are paying more attention to representation when they're expanding their reserve networks.
The result you presented about size of protected areas and the change in protection equality. What do you think about that in terms of the effectiveness of those areas? If we take Australia as an example, 80% of protected areas in Australia are less than 1,000 hectares in size, 50% are less than 100 hectares in size.
Right.
And so the question of viability of them in terms of protecting their values is obviously questionable.
Yeah, that's a big criticism, but I'd like to highlight this. This is only if you're trying to achieve equal representation, but for a lot of these global targets, you also have to be effectively managed and all these other things. So I think it just highlights the importance of including representation with these other targets because they're likely to have a lot of different other factors to maximize them. So, and also protection quality is just one way to measure representation, so it could vary. But yeah, there's a lot of criticism for smaller reserves. So yeah, it depends. Yeah.
Does protection equality always increase with area protected?
No, it doesn't. It can decrease. If you're only putting all your protected area into one region, it would be decreasing.
I was just thinking one thing you could do, your null model